Hello friend, thank you for joining me. Continuing on in our emotion series, we're going to be taking a look today at imagination. And this is going to be the first one that we touch on that is actually perhaps like a compound elemental situation that's in between two different axes. So this is a pretty concentrated on the head type emotion. There's a little bit of activation in the chest, but you see a very high concentration all the way at the top of the head. So the definition is thinking pleasant or wishful scenarios, fantasizing or ideating. And we know it more commonly as daydreaming, having your head in the clouds, a castle in the sky, being zoned out, off in space, away with the fairies, on a flight of fancy, or shooting for the moon. And so this card is in conjunction with the book The Body Keeps the Score, which may be a kind of interesting choice. Why is imagination going to be coupled with a book about trauma? And you're going to find all about that. Imagination is absolutely critical to the quality of our lives. It is an essential launch pad for making our hopes come true. It fires our creativity, relieves our boredom, alleviates our pain, enhances our pleasure, and enriches our most intimate relationships. So that's for Bessel van der Kolk. And it's interesting that imagination acts as kind of a catalyst for all of these other behaviors and forces in our lives, rather than being something super native to itself. But this activity, although it's very squarely mental, isn't necessarily, it doesn't even touch the axis of air, which is future prediction or modeling, which is really contradictory. You would think imagination would be the most airy thing possible, but it actually has this much more fluid kind of quality, although it isn't watery either. Here we have imagination, right here in this kind of limey green color, squarely between the fire axis of threat detection and the earth axis of comfort. So it acts as a bridge directly between fear and trust. Imagination is kind of how we cross that great divide, so to speak. And so what is it really? Is it escapism? Is it avoidance of discomfort? Is it a coping mechanism to just get out of the traumatic strain of whatever we're currently enduring or going through? Or is it a skill that we can actually kind of intentionally cultivate and try to get better at and utilize for the purpose of having more resilience in the face of trauma? And that's exactly what the book really explores. And I read this book at the same time I was really studying about Merida therapy, which is kind of a Zen practice. And there's a lot of kind of counterintuitive things when it comes to the actual applied method of healing from trauma. And so this book is best known for just the concept that we hold on to trauma within our bodies, or that even long after an incident occurs, we continue to get triggered and have fear responses and have difficulty navigating situations in our everyday lives that start to resemble too closely a traumatic experience that we've been through. And so there's a lot that talks about different physical practices, different trauma release things, tapping, yoga, things like that. But what I found kind of more interesting than all of those physical things, because I tried them myself and had some success, but some things, especially like yoga, got to be just kind of too triggering, honestly. Like on a physical level, as much benefit as I was getting from it physically, emotionally it just took me back to a dark place and wasn't really helping me get to much farther forward. But I found that the practices in Merida therapy, which center a lot more on acceptance and kind of running scenarios, not so much like the mental simulation, but just kind of empathetically putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Marita therapy focuses quite a bit, because it's a Japanese originating practice. It has a lot to do with some kind of propriety kind of things, such as making peace with your parents and being able to forgive your parents for the kind of upbringing you received, even and especially if that included some sort of neglect or trauma, and just being able to accept your parents as flawed human beings, as you also are, and see that they fundamentally did the best that they could. Maybe it wasn't the best for you, but it was perhaps, the best that they could, and that ultimately, now that you are independent of them, you can go back and kind of make up your own mind about it and decide for your sense of inner peace to be, kind of accepting of what happened. And so that actually is kind of in the realm of imagination and really being able to paint a different picture. And it might be kind of weird to think of it that way, but it's like if you, your whole life, have had this extreme narrative around like, oh, I had a horrible childhood, I didn't get any of the things I needed, everything sucked. It is kind of a huge flight of fancy to just imagine that maybe it wasn't exactly ideal, but some of your basic needs were met, and ultimately this is where you've gotten to now, and you can take a much more objective look at it and find, at least within yourself, some place of peace, rather than ruminating and reliving and perhaps even sensationalizing. And this isn't to say that anyone should cover up or erase or anything like that. I'm certainly not advocating for being overly forgiving if you really had severe trauma in your childhood, but also realizing that even our own narratives and our own memories can be kind of faulty, and we do ascribe a lot of emotional valence to things and a lot of meaning that may be more intense or severe than what happened. And then the contrary is also true. We can numb ourselves. So are we our most reliable narrators? Not necessarily all of the time. It's very difficult to try to ascertain some sort of perfect ultimate truth. And it's not necessarily even desirable or necessary to do so. What really matters the most is the way that we apply value and the judgments that we make. And so when we talked about the water axis as far as looking back at memories and ascribing certain emotional values to them through introspection and that whole activity, that's kind of the watery way to do it, and that has to do with kind of a little more of that backward-facing thing. Whereas imagination is still somewhat forward-facing, or at least danger-facing. So imagination really is an antidote to fear and anxiety, because it's not only taking kind of that rational stoic perspective of what's the worst that could happen, premeditation of misfortune kind of thing, but it is transcending all of what are immediate thought of possibilities, and it's going so much further into this creative realm of what are all of these other things that could happen that I haven't even thought of yet or I haven't considered, and it really frees you to imagine not only a antidote to the current situation or a solution to facing your fear that is either chronically or presently assailing you, but it presents much more holistic possibilities and ways to not only overhaul the current plight, but your entire way of being, or any limiting beliefs that you might have, right? When you really engage in imaginative play, you are accessing all of these creative scenarios that might solve multiple problems or might address some other core wound that you have, that if you were only going through this kind of airy space of determining objectively, rationally, what's the realistic way of looking at this, the extent to which you can kind of readily enter into, but also exit out of these imaginative states, is the extent to which you have creativity and resilience and adaptability in the face of future traumas that you can't even anticipate yet. And that you could spend a whole lot of time either being anxious about and foreboding or, remembering something close to that and worrying that there's a larger, bigger, worse versions out there for you in the future, and becoming, ruminating and trying to figure out how to fix these things that happened in the past, rather than either of those two directions. This lime green, trying to bridge from anxiety to comfort state, is templating and kind of building this a space. It's really like a mental space for you to be and to fit into, which is perhaps moving from the one that you're in right now. And it can be extremely liberating. And as far as the addressing of trauma and creating healing space for that, there have been a lot of recent studies into the flow state and being able to enter into a creative outlet. When flow is I believe it's like something like 11% difficulty, or like it's a very fine line between a task being creatively engaging and challenging just enough that you aren't bored out of your skull, and it's not just a grindy, repetitive thing like many like jobs would be. There's a certain threshold that goes beyond a brainless, repetitive task and actually becomes easy enough to get lost in. And they've found that this is actually ultimately a healing space, and that when you go into this, there is a certain amount of neuroplasticity that activates, and a certain healing that can occur that just gives your mind kind of space to breathe and to expand beyond the confines of the trauma that's been binding it. And it doesn't take some sort of really involved therapy or treatment, or let's go through all the things that have happened to you. It's not like this guided thing. It's extremely freeform, and there's something very freeing, not surprisingly, about that kind of freeform exploration that has a way of healing and resolving, maybe not fully, but like getting some of the binding off some of those past traumas. And that the more you have activities in your life that get you into a flow state and leave room for this, the more you can do things such as like process grief. And it is interesting that, and we'll get into this when I go over the topic of boredom itself, but I've read in several different places that boredom is actually the emotion that we avoid the most, that we hate the most, like the plague. Like that, the one thing we really don't want to be is bored. And so it makes sense then that imagination is the polar opposite of that and has all of these other potential benefits. So as far as the flow state activities, one thing that I've found just in my personal practice that's extremely important is accessing some kind of like artistic or visual flow state thing, or it could be writing, it could be anything, but something that creates more of a space or an artifact or kind of a benchmark that it's easy to come back to. And this seems to be particularly easy for children to do, and then as adults, maybe we lose a little of this ability. And of course, it springs to mind things like, Peter Pan and Neverland and like this whole archetype of imagination, right? But I think it is helpful to have some type of continuous narrative, or something that you can kind of pick up where you left off and come back to. Or, even attempting something that's just kind of a large scale. Like if you're doing some sort of mixed media assemblage or fluid art, or something that's like really at that nice difficulty threshold where you're not, composing a painting for the Sistine Chapel or something like that, but you're just doing art that is expressive and feels good, right? Anything in that kind of bandwidth. If you do that on a particularly large scale, or you do multiples, right? You're doing iterations, you're doing a bunch of them, and then maybe coalescing that into a larger shape, like something like a quilt, where you've got kind of individual units, or something that you can kind of build upon and grow from. I think those are particularly helpful for accessing this type of imagination, because then you start to create this canvas that you can then make sense upon and start to put the narrative to and project some of these things and start to notice, if there's any, it gets into, I guess, like the Jungian psychology and dream analysis, where there's also kind of daydream analysis. And it's possible to do harm and overanalyze and work things, but I do think that there is some value to keeping track of these things or journaling or having these compilation works to start to notice patterns within yourself of themes that you keep coming back to and symbols that might have particular meaning for you. And I think it's very worthwhile, if you are struggling to process trauma in particular, to have that type of habit and kind of flex those creative muscles, because I don't struggle with this. It's just come very naturally to me. So it's taken me a lot to try to understand that other people see the world differently and just have a completely different experience. And there's certainly people who are infinitely more creative than me. And just like coming to grips with the extent to which our consciousness varies from person to person, and that people, you can try and walk a mile in their shoes, but ultimately, like, you just have no idea really what their experience is. And all you can kind of do is, engage with it and be curious about it and marvel at it and the incredible diversity that we have of these subjective experiences. But I have met people and that swear up and down they're not creative, they don't have a creative bone in their body, they can't do music, they can't do art, they just don't. And with very limited success have I ever comforted anyone who finds themselves in this state. So I'm hoping that I will become better at that in time, because it seems like it would be incredibly frustrating, especially if that was a result of some sort of trauma, or if some trauma did occur that then lacked this whole level of outlet to try to work through. And I'm not very musically inclined. I've kind of did my toe in that water, but it's not my primary skill. I'm much more a visual artist. But, just hearing about how incredibly cathartic that is for people and how healing sound can be in making music, even, just for oneself, just as a personal expression, not even to produce some sort of artifact or album or anything like that. It's definitely unfortunate, at least in this country, that we have cut back so much on things like music programs, because I think it's incredibly important and a skill that should really be reinforced and developed at a young age. But we have kind of this divide, that imagination and daydreaming is bad. It's, nobody has time for that. That's a childish pursuit. And, you need to buckle down and focus and get your head out of the clouds and all those kind of narratives. Favorite, maybe this is kind of dating myself, but a very beloved movie of mine is, of course, Neverending Story. And that paints very clearly the incredible divide between the adult realm and the child realm, and how imagination is really the distinguishing realm kind of between those, with this Fantasia thing. But I don't think we've really handled it properly. I think there absolutely is like a level that is maladaptive, and that, I have definitely interacted with people in my life that live basically in a realm entirely of fantasy and just can't seem to come down to earth or accept the way that things really are, and that the whole purpose of that imagination is to build a bridge from where you currently are to where you want to be and shape that up, right? That's the point of modeling these things, not to be nitty-gritty realistic, here's the spreadsheet modeling, but to apply one's creativity and imagination to making at least their own life better, if not toward a creative pursuit that ultimately will enhance the lives of others, bring beauty or comfort into the world. Imagination is the bridge to do that. So I challenge you, if you're one of those people who just not a creative bone in their body, see if there isn't something that you can do that will get to that threshold of difficulty. And it can be something very weird, right? There's all kinds of things. There's pixel art. I was just watching a thing about a guy who used spreadsheets entirely to make entire digital paintings, which to me with Photoshop, it's horrific. Like, why would you do that? Spend so much of your life. But it's not about the end result. It's about the journey and the healing, the psychological healing, and the chemical things that are going on for us on that journey are really interesting. And I'm really excited to see what discoveries we're going to make here in the future, as a lot more things like meditation and perhaps even daydreaming are studied in a more clinical sense, and we get more of these scans and a better understanding for exactly what part of the brain are impacted and how to perhaps better work those out as if they were muscles and engage those parts of our thinking. And then also what socially we can do to destigmatize, or at least decrease the incredible divide between child, adult, imagination, serious. If we can at least figure out, like, okay, to a certain extent, this is maladaptive and you're not really living your life, and you need to maybe figure out how to leverage it better in your own experience, but we're not going to shame and denigrate and obsess over everybody has to be busting ass all the time, and anything creative is a waste, and you shouldn't go to art school because what's that going to do? You're never going to make any money and you're going to starve. We need to just get rid of the extreme narratives on kind of either side and figure out what this is and what it's really for. And so I make the case here in this video. It wasn't very concise, but what can you do? That the purpose of imagination, and therefore of art itself and expression itself, is ultimately to the end of processing trauma. That's kind of the desired result. And I think if we really start to evaluate art from that perspective, that I think the narrative would really change around, what is worthwhile, what is art even. And I think even within that space, there's a long ways to go of acceptance about what it is and what it's for, and that some of the toxicity of it has to be serious has very much crept into and overtaken, I think, even the art world in that space, where what was once maybe a flourishing and vibrant place for expression got shut down, kind of in that adult serious way, where, like, okay, now it's a gallery, now you have to, get the patron, get the client, get the get the collection, get the showing, all of these serious curated things that have destroyed a lot of the joy. And it's interesting to see so many art movements kind of come forward and push back, and things like performative art and installations really step up to challenge that. What's it for? What's it worth? What's the cathartic value? And how do we leverage that? And I think really, really examining that difficulty level, and instead of endlessly celebrating and rewarding and obsessing over, let's reward the highest technical difficulty and hyper value, a painting that took someone 10 years of their life. There's a place for that, and it's good to produce things like that, but that doesn't negate the value of someone who's an amateur, or someone who's just starting out, or who's doing it to get through something and express part of themselves. So thank you for joining me. I don't know exactly what question this was set to examine. I think that's going to be the case with a lot of these kind of compound things, where they are this weird liminal bridge between the axes, which are the primary focus of the series, and in the videos about the more striking primordial ones, like anger, fear, sadness, and things like that, it'll be more cut and dry. And then we get to these fun transitional ones that are actually helping us to be able to move around and be related to and touch neighboring emotions. And in some ways it makes sense to me, and in other ways this is an incredible challenge, because I didn't necessarily have to articulate that and the connections when I made all of the cards individually. So even this video series is a really interesting pressure for me to then articulate what those touching points are. when this deck has to perform as a total unit rather than just individual cards. So thank you for humoring me as I fumble toward understanding myself. I do think that that's somewhat helpful. I like to personally watch creators who show a lot of their process, so maybe that's helpful for you. Maybe it's kind of frustrating. But thank you for joining me on this flight of fancy into the concept of imagination. Have an awesome day.